Hello, you multi moon munchkins, and thank you to Don Be Dumb for the malt mention. That's what it says. Don Be Dumb. That's fine. This is Ralphie Review 1049 Extras, and because I'm a little bit smitten with the cold and my sense of smell is absolutely nowhere, I am taking the opportunity to discuss a little bit of hidden history as regards the production of Scotch whisky that you will never hear from the brand ambassadors, and even the official experts are very reluctant to talk about, because it's not part of the narrative. And I touched on this in my last review 1049, in which I was talking about Little Mill Distillery and the fact that one of the peculiarities of having access to old bottles of Little Mill, back in the 2000s, you could get them from Cadenheads, was a good source of Little Mill bottlings. Occasionally from Gordon and MacPhail, and occasionally from Douglas Lang, for example, independent bottlers. There was a few official bottlings of Little Mill, but they weren't particularly rated. And this is because Little Mill Distillery, a lowland distillery just to the north of Bowling in the Clyde Estuary, it has become one of those distilleries that the geeks who are really into whisky can talk about and mentally picture. There's no point in visiting Little Mill Distillery now, because it's now a compartment of flats, residential flats. And this was a way that distillery owners had of putting their distilleries completely beyond use permanently as distilleries by changing their purpose of use. And one of the easiest ways would be residential accommodation. So it's no longer industrial use, it's private residential. You see the same thing with Diageo Distillery by the name of Linlithgow, also known as St Magdalen, which you do pass on. You'll see just right beside the train station at Linlithgow, and it still has its ornamental pagodas, which it's really the only source of reference now to the fact that it was a distillery, and in many ways an iconic distillery. And iconic distilleries do get lost, but I wouldn't worry too much about it, because iconic distilleries get replaced. And we're seeing this now with the iconic status of Isle of Arran, of Ardnamurchan, of Daffmill. These are new distilleries. And so I don't sort of get too sentimental about the past, unless it's things that are specifically important that we'd be aware of. And I'm going to cover that right now. And we'll start with Little Mill, because with Little Mill, when you tasted it, it could be the most amazing lemon and lime soft malt that you could ever encounter. It could be a phenomenal whisky, or it could be absolutely rank. So you had to be very careful back in the early 2000s buying from the independent bottlers, because they weren't too bothered about putting out the off casks. And it wasn't just the casks that could be off, it could be the spirit. In fact, more often it was the spirit that was off. Because back in the 1960s and in the 1950s, post-war, but even pre-war, this was prevalent. Distillery staff were not looked after. They were very poorly paid. Now, this would vary throughout the whisky industry. In some distilleries, employers were reasonable and fair, but in other distilleries, they were not. And this has been very airbrushed out of the narrative from your brand ambassadors and even the experts. who don't want to acknowledge that staff working at distilleries, as well as the very poor pay, what would keep them there was their alcohol dependency. It was not unusual in the old days that workers at distilleries would have a red nose and a significant alcohol addiction problem. In fact, it was almost the norm, within reason. And I say this because it was frequently discussed in the bar when I was back in the 1980s, when I lived in Partick in Glasgow. Excuse me. Got to do this. When I used to go to the bar on a Friday evening, because the ladies and gentlemen would be there from the local community, and many of them worked in the whisky industry, and their parents had worked in the whisky industry, whether in warehouses or bottling plants or whatever, in offices and whatever. And many of them had come down from the Highlands because the only way they could get any work was down in Glasgow, because there was no opportunities in the Highlands. There still is very, very little opportunities in the Highlands of Scotland because it is an extremely feudal society. Please don't romanticise it. It is exactly what it is. So I'm just stating that, not because I'm taking sides or I've got any particular political leanings on it. I just like to see things as they really are, because it helps me get my bearings as to why things are the way they are. And in Little Mill, they would be working machinery and operating the stills frequently. There would be a manager around, but they would be out, doing manager stuffs. They're not going to roll their sleeves up and actually muck in. Managers don't do that. It's not part of British culture. So they would be organising for example, a fermentation over a weekend, and when you're a little bit drunk, you might get your measurings wrong when it comes to adding the yeast. And this is a perfect example, illustrative example as to why 30 years later you taste a whiskey and you go, what the hell's this all about? And they'd go away for the weekend to start to sober up by the Sunday. They'd come in just to check the distillery and discover that the washback is overflowing because they've added too much yeast. Because they thought, if I add more yeast, it'll ferment quicker, we can get the job done quicker, and I can get off quicker, because the hours are long enough as it is. But when you're adding too much yeast, particularly if the ambient temperature increases, which was prone to do in, say, September or April, fermentation would take place quicker, and it would be more aggressive, and it would bubble over the top of the washback, and it would make a hell of a mess. That's a lot of cleaning up. So what they would do to cut down the foaming of the aggression of the fermentation is they would get a cheese grater and a bar of industrial carbolic soap, and they would grate the soap over the foam, and it would saponize it. In other words, it would make it soapy. The soapy would break through the foam, and it would stop making a mess of the washback room floor. That flavour would go through the distillate, it would go into the casks, and it would remain in the casks for years and years and years. If you've ever smelt carbolic soap, it smells of coal tar, literally of road tar. And it's not the sort of fusile flavour that breaks down neatly over time, particularly in a light-styled single malt. The result of which was that us aficionados and whisky anoraks 30, 40 years later would taste from an independent bottler a glass of Little Mill, and we'd go, this is really weird. It's very strange. I mean, it's delightful and it's interesting, but this light unpeated whiskey's got a distinct carbolic note. It must have been one of the casks. They must have used an Islay cask. And then you notice this carbolic note get more and more distinctive. And that's the reason why. And the only reason I discovered this was when I actually took a bottle into the bar, and it was one of the old distillery supervisors who burst out laughing, and he says, "I know that smell anywhere. That's distillery soap. And I know exactly what they've done, and I know exactly why they did it." Staff at distilleries, literally, it was an agreed normality that half their wages were in liquor, because it made them cheaper to employ, and the distilleries would make more profit. That's the mindset. It hasn't changed. It is what it is. The staff would embrace this. If they got caught stealing, they would be sacked. This gave the opportunity for management, if they wanted rid of one troublemaker, all they do is they just cut them a little bit of slack, make it easier for them to have the opportunity to steal, catch them in the act and say, "Oh, you naughty thief, terrible, shocking, you're sacked." So they would leave, and they'd probably get a job that allowed them to be a bit more sober, to be honest, or work in a bar. That's not unusual. It was the norm. That I'll give you two examples. Staff would reward themselves by taking in like hot water bottles, because it was winter time, it was cold. They'd stick it down the front of their jackets, and it would start with hot water in it at the beginning of the shift. But by the end of the shift, as they were walking out, there was new make spirit in it that looked like water. And naturally it was cold. And who's ever going to question what's in a hot water bottle? Another thing was fire extinguishers. When fire extinguishers got there, were introduced to distillery warehouses, the staff made sure there was about 2 or 3 too many to requirements. Except they'd discharge these fire extinguishers and then rinse them out thoroughly. And then they would become reception vessels for decants from the casks. At which point, every now and again, they'd walk out with a couple of fire extinguishers, and the boss says, "Where are you going with that?" They say, "We just need to get out in the daylight so we can check it, the expiry date. We're just taking them up to the office because we're going to get the fire inspector to come down, and there's a fireman going to come down and check it all and make sure everything's in order." "Oh, that's fine, carry on." No manager realises that out of the 12 fire extinguishers that are being taken out of the warehouses to be checked and tested, at least one of them is absolutely full to the gunnels with fine single malt whisky. Another one was Wally ornaments. What would happen is a wee Wally ornament would appear in a distillery warehouse, and it would basically click a bear with the head on it and a wee frill round it, and it's just a wee, I've just given by the grandkids, blah blah. But in fact, it was a flask in disguise, and nobody would think twice about what looks like a ceramic toy just sitting around. Managers, by the way, they were more than happy to bring their golf team in for liberal refreshments. Don't think that they weren't dipping themselves. You know, managers, perks of the jobs, and it was quite normal for managers to roll up in their Jaguars and Range Rovers about midnight, and a member of staff would just quietly let them in and keep an eye on the main road, and they'd come out a couple of hours later, absolutely full of it, and just drive off. This is the other side of whisky history you don't hear so much about. It was also the case that there was one lady, and this is my final story in this, one lady who, she was an absolute gem, lovely, lovely little lady who worked in the local florist. And I was sitting with her in the pub, and I bought her a couple of gin and tonics, and she told me the story about when she was a girl and her father worked at a local distillery. What he'd do is he'd have sauce bottles, narrow sauce bottles, which he'd dip into casks. When he was going down sounding casks, right, which is knocking them with a hammer to see if they're empty or full, he'd dip a cask and he'd put it in the sauce bottle, and the sauce bottle he'd just leave somewhere else in the warehouse, so that he went out, and if he was stopped and checked, everything was fine. And then he'd wait for his time, and he'd basically kind of go to the warehouse with a piece of equipment. It could be a lawnmower or something for the grounds round the outside of the warehouse, and he would go inside and he'd pick out all these little sauce bottles, and he'd literally stack them inside the piece of equipment and then roll it back up the hill, and then he'd hide it in the undergrowth discreetly just outside the distillery gate where he could pick it up later. And he would take it along. He wouldn't take it home, and he wasn't even drinking it. He was taking it down to the local bar, where the bar manager would just buy it under the till, and he didn't get the cash. His wife would go in the following morning under the pretext that she was cleaning in the bar, or maybe she was the part-time cleaner in the bar, and then she would get the pay that was due, and this meant that she could feed her family. And the lady that I was talking to, and I think her name was Mary, talking to this in the bar, and I could clearly see she was getting very nostalgic about this, but she remembers that she knew that her father had delivered the whisky to the bar, which they would then mix with their blend and cut with a blend and just make it disappear, and it was profits for them. And she said, because Mum would be in a good mood and we'd have bacon, eggs and beans for breakfast instead of some porridge. The porridge was thin, or you'd have potato mash and butter. And it's the normal in that generation, by the way, is for kids to go to school on jelly pieces. And a jelly piece is 2 slices of pan white bread with raspberry jam in it. And that's what they went to school on. And this is factual history I'm relating to you, that you don't tend to find in the history books. You find it when you're standing in the pubs in the 1980s and you're listening to people who are no longer sober, who really are digging into their own personal life experiences and telling you their stories. It is what it is. Things have definitely changed in the industry. Things are much tighter. The wages generally, they are better, but they're still very poorly paid people in the industry. And you only have to see the publicity recently in regards to White and Mackay to get some reference to that. And the fact that there's been the threat of strikes. And that's not telling about the strikers. In my opinion, that's telling about White and Mackay. And the fact that this really shouldn't even be a situation in the 2024s. It should be becoming more historical, but if you've got historical motivated management, you're stuck in the past. And this is, when you're stuck in the past, you've got disgruntled, disillusioned employees who are threatening to go on strike, And I have no doubt for good reason. Because people have got bills to pay, debts to pay, families to feed. They just want a normal life. And there's no point in blaming firebrand trade unionists anymore, because frankly they're a thing of the past. They really are. And they were there for a reason. Very much so. But I hope you've enjoyed this little narrative. I would recommend that when you buy whisky books, you're not going to read about this. You really need to be looking at social history books in relation to whisky, and they're few and far between. Or even better, when you do come across someone that's been in the industry for decades and decades, say you're visiting a distillery, offer to buy them a wee drink in the local bar and spend some time with them and hear their stories. Because these are very rarely part of the archive.